Sorry, we're starting a little bit late. We were having some tech issues, but we are here to talk about both the new issue of Rethinking Schools and the theme that the cover is about, which is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and how we teach about that in the classroom. So my name is Adam Sanchez. I am the managing editor of Rethinking Schools. And we have put together a really incredible panel for you all tonight to think through how do we teach this moment in our classrooms, especially at a time. I'll just start by saying, for me, and I probably maybe for a lot of you, I grew up with very much the fairy tale version of the American Revolution, which I'm just going to read from our editorial. This is a summary of what it is, right? That there's these series of British laws in the 1760s that imposed new taxes on the American colonists. When the colonists rebelled against this taxation without representation, the British punished these protests, leading to outrage throughout the 13 colonies in North America, provoking a revolutionary war against British tyranny. Um, Obviously, that is a very narrow story, and it is one that has been promoted with force by the Trump administration, by his 1776 commission, and by all these kind of patriotic celebrations that we've seen, that grow more and more ridiculous, from the UFC fight in front of the White House. But also that is coupled with the campaign to really silence any other histories at the founding, right? So here, where I'm at in Philadelphia, park workers at the Independence Mall actually, used crowbars to peel off plaques that talked about and honored the nine of the people that George Washington enslaved. And those plaques have now been replaced with a whitewashed version of that history. So we want to figure out how to talk about all of this in our classrooms. And so to do that, we've put together a really incredible panel. I'm super excited. I just think all these people are incredible educators, and it's really amazing to be able to discuss this with them. So I'm just going to introduce them and then we'll jump into it. And I'll say, if you all have any questions for the panelists as we go through the panel, feel free to put them. I think there's a Q&A, and if not, there's, you can put them in the chat, and I will kind of pay attention to that so I can try to include some of those questions. Okay, so here are our panelists. We've got Tiferet Ani, who is a Zinn Education Project Prentice Charney Fellow, a history teacher, a teacher educator, and curriculum developer, and they are currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. We also have with us Mimi Eisen, who is the program manager for the Zinn Education Project, where she writes and edits curriculum, facilitates workshops, and co-coordinates the Prentice Charney Fellowship. Both Mimi and Tiff with me are based in Philadelphia. I think I was saying before we got on that this is probably the most representation Philadelphia has had on a Rethinking Schools panel. And Jesse Agopian is also joining us, a Seattle-based educator and the author of the incredible book, Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. Jesse is a founding member of Black Lives Matter at School and the director of the Zinn Education Project's Teaching for Black Lives campaign. He's also the co-editor of several books, including Black Lives Matter at School, Teaching for Black Lives, and Teacher Unions and Social Justice. All right, so we're going to jump into it. And Tiff, I want to start with you. In the new Rethinking Schools issue, you have a really incredible article titled Beyond Loyalists and Patriots, which is also the name of the lesson the article's about. which people can already access at our Zinn education project, zinnedproject.org. But the basic premise of this lesson, right, it's a mixer where students take on different roles, and basically they meet various Black and Indigenous voices from the Revolutionary era. And so I just wanted to ask you if you could start by highlighting some of the Indigenous voices, particularly that students meet in the mixer, and how that changes or challenges the dominant narrative about the American Revolution.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam, for the question. And it's a pleasure to talk about this lesson here tonight. Um, so oftentimes when we have like this multicultural education, right, we take people and who are not white and we say, oh, they were patriots, they fought for the revolution, right? Or they were enemies and they fought against American liberty. And doing that does a disservice because we assume they had the same motivations or goals as, European Americans, right? Rebels, colonists, whatever you want to call them. And Indigenous people in, Turtle Island, we're basically having a crisis of a couple centuries, right, since colonization. And one thing that two people highlight is the ways that they engaged in really incredible strategic diplomacy between multiple European powers and the new Continental Congress to try to look out for their own interests, which is preserving their ancestral homelands and maintaining their sovereignty. So, two examples, we have a brother-sister duo, Molly and Joseph Brant, of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, who engaged in diplomacy with Britain. Joseph Brant, also known as Tyendinaga, traveled to England and had a conversation with King George. And because of their support for, their alliance with the British, they were able to maintain a lot of the Iroquois land and have a whole reserve in Canada. Alexander McGilvery was doing very similar things in the southern portion of the colonies in Florida, Georgia, working with the Spanish as a counter to the United States. And another thing that we see that really is important in challenging the dominant narrative is the huge role of women in leadership among Indigenous nations. So Nanyehi, or Nancy Ward, a Cherokee leader, she was, as a tribe that had not yet fully, been encroached upon by settlers, they sort of had this dilemma of does fighting with anyone serve us, or should we try to maintain neutrality? And in fact, a lot of these big native nations, there were these fissures with different groups thinking different strategies were better, right? So there was a rift in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and among the Cherokee themselves, Nanyehi wanted to sort of straddle neutrality and try to to protect the Cherokee Nation from war. Whereas other Cherokee who were seeing the writing on the wall of the United States coming closer and encroaching on their lands wanted to fight against the new United States. So we learn a lot of lessons about the ways that the decisions made by the Continental Congress, by the colonial elite, impacted Indigenous people at this time.
Thanks, Tiff. And before we move on from you, I just want to note that there's a question in the Q&A about how much front loading do you suggest before this activity? I assume they mean like background building.
Yeah. So for us, the lesson really starts with that final grievance in the Declaration of Independence, which I think is the most important one of all the ones mentioned. And it sets up Indigenous people and enslaved people as these barriers or enemies of American liberty. And so, I always taught these very traditional American history courses that were chronological. But so I think, having some understanding of the revolution, the stakes, the different goals of different groups, and I think is helpful. But I think that with some basic, sort of looking at different maps, right? The NMAI has a map that shows only Indigenous nations. you can compare that to a map of, the French, Spanish, and British possessions. And then just be thinking about, how would these other powers fighting over this land that they actually don't own and are squatting on, right, impact Indigenous nations. So I think you might need to have some if you're not teaching an American history course and maybe they learned the revolution far back. But I think it could be a pretty quick, maybe like 20 minutes kind of establishing background information before you dive into the mixer.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to turn to Jesse, but before I do that, I just want to send a huge shout out and thank you to our ASL interpreters, Crystal Butler and Matthew Pouncey, who are helping make this accessible for all. So Jesse, I'm going to turn to you. You've written a lot about how including Black voices, both during the Revolutionary era and beyond, helps us reframe the founding of this country and the patriotic celebrations, we're seeing over the last month. So highlight some Black voices for us that you think students and teachers should be looking at to make sense of the American Revolution and the celebrations of this country's founding.
No doubt, no doubt. And it's great to be with you, Adam, and with this whole panel. This is such an important time to make sure that we educators aren't reproducing master narratives that are being constructed and imposed upon us so violently across the country, whether it's tearing down the information in Philadelphia about the enslaved people at George Washington's house, or it is the official school curriculum in Florida that declares that slavery was of, quote, personal benefit to Black people, right? We know that they are trying to whitewash the narrative of the American Revolution and teach it as a completed mission to freedom rather than a highly contested event. And I want to highlight a couple of voices because too often we teach the American Revolution from the front porch of the plantation house, right? From the perspective of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the Continental Congress. And I want students to be taught from the cotton fields and the tobacco fields and the indigenous villages. I want students to ask, what did the revolution look like from here? Right? And so, we have to highlight so many of the voices that is in the lesson that Mimi and Tiferet wrote. And, one of the first people I love to introduce students to is Phyllis Wheatley. She was enslaved as a child. She was brought from West Africa to Boston, and she became the first published Black poet. And she wrote a poem called On Being Brought from Africa to America. And she challenged the idea of Black inferiority in it. I think that her voice shows that Black people were speaking back to the American colonists before the revolution even happened, right? I mean, we need to hear the voice of Prince Hall, a formerly enslaved abolitionist who in 1777 petitioned the Massachusetts legislature, and he argued that enslaved people possessed a natural and unalienable right to freedom, right? So he took the revolution's own language seriously and demanded that it apply to Black people as well. And I really love the way Benjamin Banneker did that, right? He was the brilliant Black mathematician, astronomer, surveyor, and he wrote a letter directly to Thomas Jefferson in 1791 that I think is one of the most powerful documents in history, right? So, a few years earlier, Jefferson had written notes on the state of Virginia, and he wrote in that Black people, in reason, were much inferior to white people, right? And he wrote that in imagination, they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous, right? That's how we characterize Black people. And I want to just read for you a quick section of Banneker's reply. Let me find it here. Okay, Banneker said, quote, "Sir, how palatable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren, under groaning captivity and cruel oppression." In other words, Banneker is asking Jefferson, do you really believe the words you wrote in the Declaration of Independence, which was a question that Frederick Douglass also addressed, right? And I'll just say that in his speech in 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he looked at a nation celebrating its founding and he said, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." And that speech really hits home for me because my great-great-grandmother, Laura Ratcliffe Lenoir, was born into slavery in Mississippi the same year that Douglass delivered those words. And so when I hear that speech, I'm thinking about my own family, whose voices were not allowed to be heard, and whose perspective was not considered during the founding of this nation, and then still today when teachers teach about the American Revolution as the beginning of freedom and leave out the perspective of those who actually fought on the side of the British because the British said, we will emancipate enslaved people who are able to escape from colonial rule and fight on our side.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for that. And, I think it's what you said at the beginning, reminded me how important, to think about shifting the perspective of where we want our students to learn from, right? And both you and Tiff, I think, spoke to that, whether it's the people who are literally experiencing a genocide during the American Revolution, right? Or the people who were enslaved. I think there was a new study, right, from Howard University that said 48 of the 56 signers profited from slavery. So 86% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So people should definitely be using that statistic and that study in the classroom. Mimi, I want to turn to you. You co-wrote Beyond Loyalists and Patriots lesson with Tiff, but you also created another incredible lesson, looking beyond the Declaration of Independence, the lesson called Founding Documents We Don't Learn About. And it really makes the case that to fully understand what happened during the American Revolution, we have to look at more primary sources than just the Declaration of Independence, right? So could you highlight some of your favorite sources in that lesson and why you think those documents are important?
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for being here for this webinar. So yes, I wrote the lesson Founding Documents We Don't Learn About, which is also at the ZenEd Project website. And it's a lesson that's grounded in a set of 26 primary sources. These are letters, petitions, poems, essays, declarations that are from the era of the American Revolution, but not authored by any so-called founding fathers. Instead, they're from people or groups who are typically cast to the margins or wiped altogether from the mainstream story. And each one counters the story that the United States was born from a revolution for freedom, equality, and justice. And most of the people and these sources do this not only by criticizing the very unequal state of things, but also by urging their audiences to consider other ways that the world might be organized. So this is historical evidence that kids can see for themselves that just shatters the story that the founders carved out this righteous, ever-widening path toward equal rights for everyone, because that, I mean, as you said in the beginning, Adam, is a fairy tale. And it's one that rests on a really narrow conception of liberty, one that excludes how Indigenous people, Black people, working class, white people, and women, all these intersecting groups variably experienced the founding of the United States and the 250 years between then and now. So in the lesson, each student gets a primary source to read and analyze, and then through conversation with each other, they basically explore what words like freedom and liberty and justice meant to different people. And in doing so, they surface ideas that are far more expansive than what the founders ever intended. And so it's an invitation for students to then consider for themselves what freedom actually means and what justice really looks like, and to think about how and why historical narratives get constructed, rather than just absorbing what's broadcasted to them by a very small, powerful, white and wealthy subset of the population. So I'll highlight a few. I won't go through all 26, of course. A favorite among students I want to highlight is by Caesar Sartor, a formerly enslaved man who wrote an essay in 1774 that was printed across the front page of a newspaper in Massachusetts. So this is 8 months after the Boston Tea Party, and white colonists are trumpeting their natural rights to shrug off Britain's policies of taxation without representation. And Sartor cuts through all of that with this piece where he says, quote, "I need not point out the absurdity of your exertions for liberty while you have slaves in your houses." So here is a Black American publicly skewering a driving force of the American Revolution, which is an idea of liberty that hinges on the enslavement of Black people. And students are often astonished to learn that there were people, voicing such things, let alone in public, let alone on the front page of newspapers. And it's also just a really cool facsimile. I'm a nerd like that on the front page of the newspaper. So it's another reason I like it and why a lot of students like it, I think. Another source I love is this one broadside, which is also in the editorial for this issue of Rethinking Schools. It's a broadside by a Philadelphia mob in 1779. So the Continental Army was mostly made up of poor men forced to serve with very little pay, very few supplies, and rich merchants used wartime shortages of food and firewood and other basic goods to raise prices on all those things. And so in 1779, a mob of people plaster a broadside across Philadelphia that spoke to the unjust costs of war that were shouldered by the poor and warned the merchant class, quote, "We have turned out against the enemy and we will not be eaten up by monopolizers and forestallers." And then days later, some of them threw more than 20 wealthy men in jail for overpricing and formed a committee to lower the cost of goods. So that's a really interesting vignette around class struggle in the war. I want to mention one that is by someone that Tiff mentioned, Nanyahi Ward or Nancy Ward, because I think some of the most profound sources in this collection are from Indigenous people. So she gives a speech in 1781. She is, as Tiff was saying, she is the Cherokee Beloved Woman, which is a title that made her an official political leader of the tribe. And so she and other Cherokee leaders meet with a group of US politicians to negotiate peace because settlers are seizing more and more Cherokee land. And it's reported that US delegates were surprised to see a woman chosen to carry out such important work. And in her speech, she says, quote, "You know, women are always looked upon as nothing, but we are your mothers. You are our sons. Our cry is all for peace." And she's urging these US officials to end settler violence and uphold treaties, and also to honor women as political agents and peacemakers. And I think there's so often this celebration across the dominant curriculum around, building the country from east to west and manifest destiny and so on. But all of that rested on the dispossession and genocide of Native people, many of whom fought back and forcefully articulated their resistance and their sovereignty. And that's so important to learn about. And it's a central part of the origin story and the ongoing story of the United States. And then just lastly, because we are a group of educators, I'll highlight a primary source by Robert Coram, who was a teacher and librarian in Delaware. He fought for the US in the Revolutionary War, but then was furious to see political elites create or deepen inequalities in the new country. He observed that in the US, quote, wealthy and dignified mortals roll along the streets in all the parade and trappings of royalty, while the lower class are not half so well fed as the horses of the former. And so he wrote a long pamphlet in 1791 that advocated for a universal public school system as an important step to help close the wealth gap. And he sent this proposal to George Washington, then president, and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State. Neither of them replied. And unfortunately, Coram died young in relative obscurity, but he laid out this radical vision of education and economic justice that echoes later on in new generations of teachers and activists. So there are many more sources and dimensions to this lesson and to this history more broadly, but the point is that there were all of these people left out of the mainstream story who expressed far more expansive visions of freedom and justice than did the people called the Founding Fathers, and that any expansion in rights and freedoms since then have been hard fought and won from the bottom up, never just benevolently granted from the top down by political elites before, during, and after 1776. And so that's the history I want students to see for themselves in this lesson and to have in their toolbox as they read and act upon the world today.
Yes, yes. What I love about both of these lessons and the folks that people have described is so much of the defense we get of the Founding Fathers is, they were products of their time. They were men of their time, right? And just the saying of that, right, is actually excluding all these other voices of the time. People who were protesting genocide, right? People who were fighting against racism and fighting for abolition, right? People who were putting wealthy people hoarding groceries and making the prices too high, throwing them in jail, right? Those were also people of the time, and they're people who also seem to have relevance for our time, right? I want to turn to back to Jesse, because you have a newer lesson also on the Zin Education Project website about the Constitution, right? It's called "We the People: Whose Rights Does the Constitution Protect?" Right, and often when we're talking about a unit on the American Revolution, teachers kind of bookend Declaration on one end, Constitution on the other. And of course, I also want to give a shout out we've had this powerful Constitution role play available by Bill Bigelow that I used to use in my class. But Jesse, I'm curious about your new lesson. Can you talk a bit more about that and what you hope teachers and students take away from it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this lesson really came from my memories of standing in elementary school, proudly reciting the preamble to the Constitution from memory, right? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? And I thought I was memorizing those words in order to be a great student and a good citizen, right? But nobody ever asked me a more important question. Like, what rights does the Constitution actually protect, and what rights does it leave out? Right? And so that's the question that's at the heart of this lesson. So it begins with students getting a list of 25 rights, right? It's got the right to free speech, the right to health care and housing and public education and food and clean drinking water, the right to bear arms, the right to a living wage, the right to paid family leave, and then the students have to guess which one of these rights are guaranteed by the Constitution and which are left out. And most of them are very surprised at the answers, right? Because then we compare what their guesses were to what the Constitution actually guarantees. And, we had some amazing responses. One student said that they were surprised by the sheer number of human necessities that were not rights. The student said, quote, clean drinking water, food, housing are not, but the right to bear arms is. The priorities are a bit interesting, unquote. Right? Another said, my main takeaway is that the United States still has a lot of work to do and that we need to play an active role in making sure our government upholds our rights, right? That's a fundamentally different approach to teaching the American Revolution and the Constitution that came out of that, right? Because the original Constitution protected slavery, right? It enshrined slavery as the law of the land in several different ways, right? One by the 3/5 clause that counted black people who were enslaved as 3/5 of a human being for representation purposes, and also the Fugitive Slave Act clause, right? And it really enshrined the power of wealthy white landholders, right? It didn't even allow poor white people access to the franchise, right? And even after it was amended, it still didn't guarantee many of the things we need to live with dignity, right? It doesn't guarantee things that many other countries have in their constitution, right? So the other part of the lesson is they can compare the U.S. Constitution to other constitutions that actually do guarantee health care and housing and education, right? Or a healthy environment. Those aren't constitutional rights in the United States. And I think the larger lesson is that the Constitution is not the sacred document that it is often portrayed as in too many textbooks, right? This sacred document handed down by these holy people, right? It's actually a human document written at a particular moment in history that reflected profound compromises with oppression and sometimes even championing oppression, right? And every major expansion of rights that were added to the Constitution came from collective struggle, right? The abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the Reconstruction era, right? All of that. So I think, especially at a moment like now when constitutional rights are under attack, right? Whether that's due process, freedom of speech, right? The 14th Amendment is under attack. Voting rights are under attack, right? Especially in this time, I want young people to know both the rights that they have, that we have to fight vigorously to defend, and the many rights that are completely absent in America that we have to fight for today. So that's, to me, really what Constitution Day should be about, what teaching honestly about the Constitution should be about.
Whew. Man, it's, in one way, it's like, it sounds so radical. And then the other way, it's like you're basically making an argument. We should historicize and contextualize, the Constitution, right? And so it's actually a pretty simple thing, right? That historians and are expected to do. And so as history teachers, we should also, teach our students to be able to do. Another important way to kind of historicize and contextualize the American Revolution, and this is really a question for any of you, I'm curious your thoughts, is, the international context, right? That we are, one of the big arguments in Rethinking Schools and at Zen Education Project is that it's important to see the history of the American Revolution in the international context as part of this age of revolutions. And so I'm just curious to hear from you all, why is that important? How does this change, particularly put the international dimension, change the way we view the American Revolution?
Well, I think it helps students question whether the American Revolution was really radical or revolutionary, right? By comparing it to the Haitian Revolution and also to revolutions that came afterwards, like the Mexican Revolution. And just looking at the founding documents, right? So like the Declaration that was put out with the Haitian Revolution, the Declaration of Sentiments that was put out with the Mexican Revolution, they guaranteed so much more expansive rights than the Constitution, as Jesse just pointed out, right? In the Mexican Declaration of Sentiments, they abolished slavery, they abolished torture, they restricted like prison sentences. So I think that students can see what was possible at the time, what other people were doing, and use that to sort of question American exceptionalism. And did we really go as far as we could, right? And why were those compromises necessary? The system that was created here, whereas protecting property at all costs or wealthy people was not the goal in other places.
No, I completely agree. I think that that's such an important point. And that's why I got Toussaint on my shirt here today, because I actually think it's impossible to understand the American Revolution honestly without analyzing the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution breached all the walls that the US and European empires had tried to erect around the idea that freedom was the sole property of white people, right? And it really rescued the idea of emancipation as a natural human condition, right? So I think too often we teach 1776 as if it was the fulfillment of freedom, but the Haitian Revolution forces us to ask a different question: freedom for who, right? Because beginning in 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue defeated the armies of the French, the British, and the Spanish, right? The three biggest armies in the world were brought down by the people of Haiti. The first Black Republic was founded. It's the only nation in history born from a successful slave revolution. And here's the comparison that I want students to make. The U.S. Constitution protected slavery. The Haitian Constitution declared slavery is forever abolished, right? The Haitian Revolution went further. It outlawed racism, right? It said that we are just going to consider people, no matter what their background, they're all now Haitians, right? And that completely undermines one of the most common excuses that we hear today from, Prager University, spewing lies about the American Revolution and everything else, is we can't judge the founding fathers from today's moral outlook, because, as you said, Adam, they were just people of their time, right? But the Haitian Revolution shows us that there were actually radical ideas at the time that were about making everybody free, right? And so Thomas Jefferson was terrified by the Haitian Revolution. He has some really despicable takes on Black people getting free, right? He was deeply saddened by the Haitian Revolution. He says, quote, that he admitted it had given considerable impulse in the minds of slaves to get free. He was frightened that enslaved people in America would learn about the Haitian Revolution and then also want to get free, right? And, Prager University, they have a video that says that the white people were the first to free enslaved folks, right? When actually Haitian people freed themselves, when Black people showed how freedom could actually be defined as freedom for everyone, right? And so for me, teaching the American Revolution has to be done in the context of teaching the age of revolutions and especially drilling down on the story of the Haitian Revolution, because I think if we want the next 250 years to bring us closer to freedom than the last 250 years, we have to stop teaching 1776 as the pinnacle of ideas about equality, and we actually have to look at revolutions that went much farther than the one in this country.
Thank you.
I just want to say, like, everything Tiff and Jesse said, but for teachers, based on all that, I just want to recommend Kelly Carter Jackson's excellent chapter on revolutions in her book We Refuse, because it's really kid friendly. And I wrote some discussion questions to go along with it, and Dr. Jackson and her publisher kindly gave us permission to post the whole chapter as a PDF for teachers to use in the classroom with the discussion questions. So that's available at ZenEd too. But yes, just want to co-sign everything Jesse just said and Tiff.
Yeah, this is such a good conversation. It's really, I mean, for me, it's really bringing up, I've done a lot of work on the Teach Reconstruction campaign and thinking about Reconstruction, as Eric Foner calls it, the second founding, right? And where actually you had poor Black and white people throughout the South rewriting the state constitutions of the South, right? And so even in our own country, there are these examples of constitutions actually getting rewritten and completely revised in a particularly revolutionary moment. But I also, while we're talking internationally, I wanted to bring up another issue that I know all of us have been thinking and writing about. And maybe part of this is a little bit selfishly trying to promote my article in Rethinking Schools, right? Which is not on the 250th revolution or anniversary of the American Revolution, but it's right after that section. But I think it's really important. But also, I think, the 250th anniversary is that is about, the intersection between, the article I wrote is about the intersection between Jewishness, race, class in this country. Mimi and I are on this study group around Molly Crabapple's new book on the Jewish Bund. Tiff, I know you've been working on some of the lessons around thinking about anti-Semitism in a different way from the popular kind of media ADL way. Jesse, co-edited Teaching Palestine with me and has a lesson in the book about settler colonialism, which links nationalist stories of Israel and the United States. I'm just really curious to hear from you three in this moment, where there's this push in Congress to possibly even integrate the US and Israeli militaries. How might learning a more complex picture of the origin of the United States and the origin of Israel help us understand kind of what we're seeing today in this moment?
Yeah, it's a really important question you're asking, and I don't think that you can understand current events today without understanding what settler colonialism is and how the American Revolution really was a project of settler colonialism rather than freedom making. I think that we have to understand that, in fact, what historian Nick Estes described, an Indigenous historian, talks about the American Revolution as a genocide, right? George Washington was called the town destroyer because during the fights with the British, he actually helped to destroy dozens of indigenous towns and villages during the Revolutionary War. And so, I think for anti-colonial thinkers, we really have to see that so much of the genocidal destruction that's happened in our world today comes out of a politics that emerged from the American Revolution that dehumanized indigenous people and said that they were less than human and that their land was there for the taking, right? And so one of the lessons I co-wrote in teaching Palestine is called What is Settler Colonialism? And instead of beginning with the definition of settler colonialism, students instead become historians and they compare three case studies. They look at the colonization of indigenous people in North America, they look at apartheid South Africa, and then they look at Israel and Palestine. And they look for reoccurring patterns and themes, right? They ask questions like, is there an outside power that takes control of indigenous land? Are settlers encouraged to move there permanently? Are indigenous people displaced and denied equal rights or subjected to efforts that would erase their culture? Right? And then they come up with their own name. They look at these three historical studies and they try to name what's happening there. And they come up with their own name. And then only after they've found connections between those three different societies do we introduce them to the concept of settler colonialism. And we explain that it's different than other forms of colonialism, where it's not just about extracting wealth, but it's also about taking their land and moving people from afar. And then it's also about establishing that permanent settler colonial society. And I think it's important because you can't understand the genocide that's happening in Gaza today without understanding the U.S. model for colonizing lands that has been rolled out by imperialist nations time and time again. And that's a very different view of the American Revolution that allows you to better understand our current society and our current world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, and I mean, the founding myths of both the United States and Israel would have you believe that like the melding of these two powers is the dream, that these are, the good guys teaming up for more. Because the United States and Israel have to be, two of the most propagandized countries in the world. I mean, these are two countries, as Jesse was just saying, whose existence and power and freedoms that some people enjoy hinge on the oppression of others and on settler colonialism specifically, and just ongoing untold violence. And I mean, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors who immigrated to New York, but the synagogue I went to as a kid here in the U.S. Was one that explained the founding of Israel with that refrain that it was, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land. That Jews, persecuted in Europe had this safe haven to evacuate to, this place that was just waiting for them to form a Jewish state, when in fact that land was Palestine, a land inhabited by the Palestinian people, who were killed and forced off their land or into second-class citizenship by Zionists, by Israel, which is, of course, engaged in an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people with U.S. tax dollars. And then meanwhile, also funded by U.S. tax dollars, among other things, right now, are these PragerU freedom trucks. And now I'm going to talk about a PragerU video like Jesse did earlier. These trucks that are careening around the U.S. to deliver AI slop videos about the American Revolution. And there's one where an AI Thomas Jefferson drones on about how, quote, westward expansion was necessary for this nation's health and prosperity to create an empire of liberty, and that freedom depends not on force, but on the cultivation of an enlightened mind, which is absurd when you know that the real Jefferson is someone who himself enslaved over 600 people and played a key role in the US government for decades in the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous people. And mind you, this video is made even more absurd by the fact that AI Thomas Jefferson does not blink even once while saying all this, even though he's talking for like a minute and a half. But when you learn these truer, more complex origins of both the U.S. and Israel, it becomes so clear that the founding myths of both of these countries are just like incredibly self-righteous, so as to hide and strengthen their ability to commit this just unspeakable violence, often together now, in order to seize more and more power and to erase the people who have resisted these projects all along. So sort of like, I mean, to your question, Adam, like it's no wonder that as there's growing knowledge and resistance to the US and Israel's genocide and ICE and AI and the billionaire class and fossil fuels and the climate crisis, like all of which are intertwined, that these countries are doubling down on their founding myths and these systems and these atrocities which we oppose. And a clear majority of the American public is now against deepening the alliance between the US and Israel. And yet a bill may pass Congress, I think just passed the House yesterday, that basically melds these two militaries such that the US automatically gives military aid to Israel because they're just like fused together. It's almost as if Congress is an undemocratic institution. It's almost as if the Constitution, like Jesse said, is an undemocratic document. And Jesse's lesson and other resources where we can examine some of those things help explain some of what we're seeing now. But lastly, Adam, just because you brought up our study group around Molly Crabapple's book on the Jewish Labor Fund, who she points out, celebrated Eastern European Jews as a people, and emphasized that they could never escape any of their problems by the dispossession of other people. And she also says in the book, especially reflecting on Jewish history in the 20th and 21st centuries, that, quote, we all have the capacity to be victims and tormentors, as well as bystanders staring blankly at a burning wall, and that she wants off the samsara wheel of atrocity, and that the Bun's demands of solidarity across difference is the only way to get there. And I think that for the most part, learning these histories, these origin stories, doesn't tell us exactly how to get there because we live in a different context where some tactics that didn't work then might work now or vice versa. But these histories help us read the world that we inherited and identify who or what are the causes of injustice in our time and ask better questions and see ourselves together, like all of us here, everyone in this webinar, all of our kind of networks, as historical actors in a continuum, taking up the mantle of previous generations and for future generations. And so I think that every kid and every person should have a chance to examine the more complex picture, as you put it, and grow those sensibilities.
Yes. Thank you, Mimi. And I was thinking like that is our demand for kids, right? To have the right to that kind of learning. Tiff,
Yeah, I
did you
just
want
want
to
to
close us out?
quickly add that I really love Jesse's lesson. And I think some really good visuals to help students understand that. Visualizing Palestine has some amazing maps that show depopulation and also land loss over time. And comparing those maps to maps of decreasing Indigenous land and the current reservations today shows a really incredible visual pattern that I would pair with that. And I'm also just thinking, as Mimi and Jesse are talking, having students, question the idea of the nation state, especially an ethno-nationalist nation state, and think about the dangers of it across time and place would be another sort of like really big theme that I can see social studies courses talking about.
Yes, man. This has been so amazing. And I just, I can't think of a better way to spend a Thursday night. Honestly, it was great to be in this conversation with y'all. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank both the panelists, but also our ASL interpreters and all the teachers on the call. if you can just kind of make a if I'm going to ask you, once this video comes out, please share it, because there's 50 of us on this call. I want hundreds of people, hundreds of teachers across this country to see this video, because I think this is a really important conversation to be having about how do you actually teach the American Revolution in the context of the American Revolution and in the context of today, and what we and our students are seeing happening in this country and in this world. Lastly, I just want to say you can stay involved with Rethinking Schools by subscribing to our magazine, adding our books to your library, and attending our upcoming events. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Take care, y'all. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Adam, for moderating.
Yes.